Telecameras 3 and 4 working. Activate radio contact with the outside.
Love, wisdom, abundant life. Live a life filled with meaning, purpose, and a sense of accomplishment.
Can you hear me?
Welcome to the Teachings of Enoch. I'm your host, James Allen. You can contact me, 702-483-7769. That's 702-483-7769. Or online at teachingsofenoch.com. Let's get started with today's message. Today on the program, I'm continuing my discussion with Judith Mendelsohn Rood. She is professor of history and Middle East studies at Biola University in La Mirada, California. And we are talking about Syria's modern history. Syria after the 40s, going into the 50s and 60s, was there a period of stability for them there, or what? How did the ruling class kind of play out in all this?
Syria was famous for its coups. It had a large number, maybe the highest number of coups in the world between 1949 and the rise of Hafez al-Assad in 1970. So you had a lot of different governments in Syria, and one of the things that emerges during this time period is the emergence of the Ba'athi Party. The Ba'ath Party is a great topic for Christians and Americans in general to understand, because it was a party founded by Christians. Is that surprising to you?
Yes, it is.
The Ba'ath Party was founded by Christians in an attempt to forge a new identity for themselves in league with their Muslim co-citizens in these countries. The Christians wanted to be accepted by the Muslims as part of their countries. So the idea was to establish an Arab nationalist party in the Middle East in which Christians could be part, and that therefore the state would see that their interests were the state's interests. And that's why we have close identification of the of the Christians with the regimes that were established in Iraq and in Syria. And so people have asked, I have a lot of different contacts and students and friends who come from these countries, and they generally support Assad, and they generally supported Saddam Hussein because they realized that that was the government that would protect them against these Islamist powers, which I just generally group with the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood is a jihadist organization. They want to establish a new caliphate that is a Sunni caliphate that would be similar to what they think of as the beginnings of the Islamic experiment. But, of course, most Muslim moderates and Christians were secular. They weren't interested in this. They did not necessarily think that liberal democracy was of any interest to them, because they were in an anti-imperialist, anti-Western mode. And so their own personal freedom was not as important as the independence of their countries. They were striving for independence. They did not have, you could see, a very realistic view of politics, and they were more than happy to be supported by the Soviet Union in their anti-Western stance.
How did the Assads get in power?
Hafez al-Assad, very shrewd guy. In a sense, a power politics person who gladly was supported by the Soviets. They went through the motions like all of the Soviet-supported countries to have constitutions, but it was not really and truly any kind of democracy. So they have these legislatures and so on, and they were voted into power in 1970. And Hafez al-Assad was Bashar al-Assad, the current leader's father, and he was a brutal dictator. They merged for Egypt and Syria merged for a short period of time in the 60s to try to see if they could create a two-front front against Israel, but that fell apart. And actually, Egypt is the most important Arab country, and Syria always wanted to become the most important Arab country. And so Sadat was the leader of Egypt. Sadat was able to turn to the West and say, hey, we're going to throw the Soviets out because we don't really like them, and we want you to support us. And so we're willing to sign a peace agreement, but we want to be the leading Arab country, and we want to take on Syria, i.e. the Soviet Union, in the Middle East. So there is this aspect that also was playing out. So let's just recognize that the Ba'ath Party in Syria was basically a tool of the Soviet Union, and that helps to give us some background for Putin and what he's been talking about lately in the newspaper.
Now, Syria wasn't really kind to its neighbors either. It wanted to be a dominant power, like you said.
They didn't recognize, for example, Lebanon's sovereignty. They considered Lebanon a province, and I would have to look up the Beirut Spring, but it was just about 5 years ago. I'm going to see if I can find that date, but I'm not sure that I will be able to while I'm talking to you. But at any rate, there was a brief Beirut Spring that was suppressed, but not through force of arms, because there was legislation that forced Syria basically to recognize the sovereignty of Lebanon in recent history. Let me also mention that Hafez al-Assad was brutal to his own people, and when I was in graduate school in the 1980s, we were all shocked when he went into Hama in 1982, I think, and the number of people massacred at that time was somewhere between 20 and 30,000 people, and no one blinked. No one blinked.
I'm talking with Judith Mendelsohn Rood. She is professor of history and Middle East studies at Biola University in La Mirada, California. I'm James Allen. You're listening to the teachings of Enoch. We'll be back after this.
Inventions intrigue me. I was reading about the walkie-talkie, and I read it was a military invention. That surprised me, because usually military stuff has strong names, Apache helicopter, Tomahawk missile. Walkie-talkie? How did that slip through the system? It's a general talking to some guy. What do you have there, soldier? Well, it's a new communication device. It's untethered, which will enable the troops to speak effectively when they're in the field. What's it called? Walkie-talkie. Look, I'm walkie and I'm talking. Now you walkie and talkie, General. I'm walkie and talkie. Are you walkie and talkie? I like it, soldier. What's this explosive device? The whammy kablammy. And this is the Rudy Tooty aim and shoot it.
Can run on for a long time, run on for a long time, run on for a long time. Sooner or later gotta cut you down, sooner or later gotta cut you down. Go tell that long-tongued liar, go and tell that midnight rider, tell the rambler, the gambler, the backbiter, tell him that God's gonna cut him down. Tell him that God's gonna cut him down. Well, my goodness gracious, let me tell you the news. My head's been wet with the midnight dew. I've been down on bended knee, talking to the man from Galilee. He spoke to me in a voice so sweet, I thought I heard the shuffle of angels' feet. He called my name and my heart stood still when he said, John, go do my will. Go tell that long-tongued liar, go and tell that midnight rider, tell the rambler, the gambler, the backbiter, tell him that God's gonna cut him down. Tell him that God's gonna cut him down. hide your hand, working in the dark against your fellow man. But as sure as God made black and white, what's done in the dark will be brought to the light. You can run on for a long time, run on for a long time, run on for a long time. Sooner or later, gotta cut you down. Sooner or later, gotta cut you down. Go tell that long-tongued liar, go and tell that midnight rider, tell the rambler, the gambler, the backbiter, tell him that God's gonna cut you down. Tell him that God's gonna cut you down. Tell him that God's gonna cut you down.
Today on the program, I'm continuing my discussion with Judith Mendelsohn Rood. She is professor of history and Middle East studies at Biola University in La Mirada, California, and we are talking about Syria's modern history. Judith, history has not been kind to Syria's neighbors, particularly Lebanon. They have had a history of being behind the assassinations of its leaders, prime ministers. Can you speak to our listeners and shed a little bit of light on that?
And most recently, in 2005, they assassinated Prime Minister Rafiq Hariri, who was a Sunni, who was working with Saudi Arabia to stabilize Lebanon after their civil war, which is another big story that we haven't talked about. And finally, because of that assassination and their complicity in it, they had to recognize Lebanese sovereignty because a consequence of that. Yeah.
So who are the factions that are trying to destabilize the regime in Syria? Are these, I mean, we hear a lot of things in the current media about, well, it's these Al-Qaeda and this and that and everything, but it seems like it's much more than that, going back in what you're talking about in the history. There's a lot of different factions that probably just had enough of this guy and this regime of brutalizing him.
Well, of course, the people that were killed in Hama back then were Sunni Muslims, and of course the Muslim Brotherhood had been present there. So that's one of the things that happened in 1982. So, of course, there's been a festering, I'm just going to just say cesspool, okay, of Muslim Brotherhood activism throughout the region, and they've always wanted to destabilize all of the current regimes in the Middle East because they don't consider any of them legitimate. So they're just a destabilizing factor, period. And it's a racist movement, and the fact that our government has been supporting them has just been a shock and an insult to those of us who've been studying Middle Eastern history. Who else is there? Well, of course, the Soviet Union collapsed in 1989, and so who filled in the gap? Iran. In 1979, we had the Iranian Revolution. Syria was allied with Iran against the other states in the region, and so I'm going to fast forward now, and I'm going to start talking about 2010. In 2010, I started watching YouTube video coming out of Syria, mostly coming from the town of Latakia, which is on the coast. And I started to see people in the streets demonstrating and saying in Arabic, La Iran. They were saying no to Iran. And what they were up in arms about, and they weren't yet in arms, they were just protesting, was the takeover of their country by two paramilitary organizations. One was the Al-Quds Force from Iran, and the other was Hezbollah from Lebanon. So the Lebanese revolutionary government had taken over Syria by 2010. And in fact, the Iranians had begun to develop a port and sent their warships to the eastern Mediterranean for the first time in history in that year. And the Israeli airstrike that destroyed something in Syria destroyed that port. By the way, at the same time, the Soviet, or I shouldn't say Soviets, let's just say Putin. Putin had developed a new port also near Latakia, and Latakia is kind of the a refuge of last resort of the Alawite family. Okay, and when you think about the Alawites, it's not fair to paint the whole group with one paintbrush, but unfortunately all of the Alawites look to the Assad family for protection. We can talk more about this in a minute, but Latakia is their last refuge, and so that has been built up, and that's where the first battles began to really be fought out that the world see because of YouTube and other technology. But there are other towns. If you go back to 2010 and just start looking at things that started happening in March, April, you'll see what this conflict has really been all about. It's more than 2.5 years. It's really 3 years plus.
Well, it certainly has been devastating to that region, and many, many lives have been lost.
You know what's been devastating, James? What's been devastating is that our government has not cared about any of these superpower developments and did not want to deal with it. We've been, of course, fighting wars in Afghanistan and in Iraq, and this whole idea that you get war-weary is not a really adequate response from a country that unfortunately wears the mantle that we have responsibility that our country actually bears, and it's a burden, and it's not fun, and it's not because of ideological reasons. It's really a survival issue. What kind of regimes do we want to live under? Do we want to live under a free regime like the one that we have today? Or do we want to be suppressed by ideological movements that would like to take over the world? Well, that's the question. I'm an old cold warrior.
Well, we've got a lot of things that are going to be coming up in the next few months. We'll see how that plays out with the international community. There's a lot of jockeying for power and a lot of public relations going on with Putin. Of course, our country and France is involved in this, and some of the other Western powers. We'll kind of have to see how this unfolds.
Today on the program, I'm talking with Judith Mendelsohn Rood, Professor of History and Middle East Studies at Biola University in La Mirada, California.
There's something happening here, but what it is ain't exactly clear. There's a man with a gun over there, telling me I got to beware. I think it's time we stop, children. What's that sound? Everybody look what's going down. There's battle lines being drawn, and nobody's right if everybody's wrong. Young people speaking their minds are getting so much resistance from behind. Time we stop. Hey, what's that sound? Everybody look what's going down. What a field day for the heat. 1,000 in the street, singing songs and a carrying signs, mostly say hooray for our side. It's time we stop. Hey, what's that sound? Everybody look what's going down. Paranoia strikes deep into your life, it will creep. It starts when you're always afraid. Step out of line, the man come and take you away. We better stop. Hey, what's that sound? Everybody look what's going. We better stop. Hey, what's that sound? Everybody look what's going. We better stop now. What's that sound? Everybody look what's going. We better stop.
Today on the program, I'm talking with Judith Mendelsohn Rood, professor of history and Middle East studies at Biola University in La Mirada, California.
Where do you see things headed? I mean, I know you don't have a crystal ball, but you've got a pretty good sense of who the important people are and the people with power and guns in there. Where do you think? Do you think the Assads will stay in power there in Syria?
Well, it all depends on whether or not the American population is willing to put up with useful idiots in government. If we continue to want to avoid dealing with the issues that are right in front of our faces, and we want to turn to Israel as the policeman of the Middle East, and that's what we're going to do, well, I don't think the future looks very good for anybody, especially the people in the Middle East. But if the people in our country wake up and recognize who the enemy really is, we should demand the removal of Assad from power immediately. We should not be happy with any kind of just slap on the wrist, and we should push Putin back into another region. And we have to deal with Iran. We've been waiting to deal with Iran since 1979, and we have been playing chicken with them, and we've done it badly. We've made tremendous mistakes under both Republican and Democrat administrations. I believe we can learn from history and avoid mistakes. We'll make our new mistakes, undoubtedly, because this is an imperfect world, and we try things and they don't work. But we really have to find our resolve, and we really do have to stand up for the sanctity of human life. We have to be willing to protect the weak. And so we talked a little bit right now about this doctrine of right to protect, R2P. It's the idea that the powers of the world should intervene in humanitarian crises. It was developed by Samantha Powers, who's now our UN ambassador. And it's great on rhetoric, but it's been very hard to implement. But the general impulse, I think, is good. But we have to have resolve, and we have to be wise. But number one, we have to remove Assad from power. And we have to protect that country, and we can do it from the air. When Clinton finally decided to start acting to defend Bosnia, you didn't have to put boots on the ground. Christiana Manpour was speaking rather brilliantly on CNN yesterday. No one would let her talk, but she was right. We could cow these powers quickly. They seem much more dangerous to us than they really are, and I think it's time to have a more robust foreign policy.
Well,
but also, I don't want the Muslim Brotherhood to take over either. That's the big mistake. I mean, I don't agree with those senators who've been saying let's support the Muslim Brotherhood. We can't really let the Saudis continue to just send in jihadist fighters from around the world in their own prisons to fight this war. We need to basically stand up for our principles and to support the moderates in the Middle East, which we have not done. We failed the people in Iran. We failed the people in Lebanon. We have failed everybody who's dependent upon us. God willing, we won't have failed Israel because Israel can defend itself. But I don't want Israel, and Israel doesn't want to be the policeman of the Middle East. But I know that they're the ones who finally take action. They bombed the Syrian nuclear reactor in the 80s in Iraq, and they put an end to the Iranian port in Lebanon. And they will do what they need to do in Africa or the Middle East or in Europe in order to preserve the safety of their population. And believe me, the Arabs and the Palestinians that live under the control of Israel are secretly saying, at least Israel understands what will happen if they don't protect us, the public opinion that they'd have to deal with. So there's a certain reality that Arab people will say quietly about the power politics of their region and who they really trust to protect their lives.
My guest today on the program is Judith Mendelsohn Rood. She is professor of history and Middle East studies at Biola University in La Mirada, California. And this program is The Teachings of Enoch. I'm James Allen.
What's going on?
What are they stopping for?
Love, wisdom, abundant life. That's my hope for you. You've been listening to the Teachings of Enoch. I'm James Allen, your host. You can contact me 702-483-7769. That's 702-483-7769. Or online at teachingsofenoch.com.